Hello, and welcome to the second panel of the Federalist Society's 9th Annual Executive Branch Review Conference. My name is Stephen Tepp, and I will be moderating this panel on the subject of trade and its cross-cutting equities, new horizons, new challenges. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. The audience may type questions at any time in the Q&A tab in the upper right corner of your screen. There's also a chat tab for attendees to chat with each other, but please do not use the chat to ask questions. We'll also be allowing attendees to ask questions live later in the program by pressing the raise hand button. Of course, you'll need a working microphone and the technical ability to unmute yourself to use this option. As I open the panel, let me note that my comments here today do not necessarily reflect the views of any client or employer. Trade was a primary foreign policy tool of the Trump administration, with Ambassador Lighthizer winning bipartisan praise despite his aggressive actions, perhaps most notably the imposition of tariffs against an array of products from China. In contrast, President Biden reportedly views trade through the lens of foreign policy. He halted trade agreement talks and staffed most of the top ranks of the U.S. Trade Representative's office with longtime congressional staffers, including the ambassador herself. However well regarded they may be, it raises questions about their leadership experience and clout within the administration. But if anyone thought this administration was going to be sleepy on the trade front, that impression was shattered earlier this month when Ambassador Tai announced the U.S. was prepared to accept some form of a waiver of intellectual property obligations under the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. For those not familiar with the issue, this proposal is from India and South Africa, not merely to take advantage of existing flexibilities in WTO rules, but rather to suspend whole categories of IP obligations entirely, a property rights kill switch, if you will, for patents, copyrights, and other IP, at least as originally proposed. While the stated motivation is to hasten production of a COVID vaccine, there is agreement across the spectrum that voluntary licenses have already been in place and that IP rights are simply not an obstacle to vaccine production, which makes the move look more political than substantive. Further, this unprecedented move contradicts U.S. policy dating back to at least the Reagan administration that promoting the protection of American intellectual property abroad is in our national interest. On top of that, the administration faces questions on digital era issues, such as a variety of criticisms of the major internet platforms, including the immunities of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, as well as challenges on cybersecurity, as everyone whose car is running low on gas can tell you. And oh yeah, China. Lots for our panel to talk about. So let me begin with the introductions. The Honorable F. Scott Keefe is a former commissioner of the U.S. International Trade Commission and advisor to the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations on national security and economics. He's the Stevenson Research Professor at George Washington Law School and a member of the European Academy of Arts and Sciences and Arts. Dr. Thomas Grant is a fellow of the Letterpock Center for International Law at the University of Cambridge and is a practicing lawyer focused on international trade, investment, and national security. He served from 2019 to 2021 as Senior Advisor for Strategic Planning in the State Department's Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. He's a former U.S. designee to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Unfortunately, our third panelist had a last-minute personal matter arise that prevents his participation, but we will carry on, and I will do my best to play devil's advocate and make sure that we have a variety of perspectives discussed in the course of the panel. And of course, our accomplished panelists' full bios are available online. So with that, let me turn to our first presentation from Scott Keefe. Scott?
Thank you very much, Steve. What a pleasure to join you in this discussion. And I will also try to emphasize multiple perspectives, recognizing that we're down one panelist so that we get a range of views included. As we think about the set of topics, intellectual property, national security, trade, antitrust or competition, boy, these topics are interacting so much these days, and they were years ago and administrations ago, but it seems as though the curve is ever upwards on the degree and the nature of the interactions. So you flagged the IP waiver relating to COVID vaccines. It's an interesting topic. It's an area where some people worry, gosh, is this a very anti-IP move? Certainly today's Wall Street Journal suggests that there are those in the Senate who think that these IP rules never should have existed in the first place. I think one wonders, though, whether the right way to think about what's happening right now is to envision it as an overture towards some true or correct destination instead of an overture towards, as you put it, politics and political economy. So let me be explicit about the metaphor or the idea to have in mind. If you are running a business like Sotheby's or Christie's, an auction house, the last thing you want is one bidder coming to your auctions, and the last thing you want to run out of is stuff to put up for auction. In the language of Washington, inside the Beltway speak, there's a dichotomy people often flag between having an issue and solving an issue. The concept of driving to a correct answer presumes that there's an issue needing a solution. The concept of having an auction is, I think, quite cozy with, compatible with the concept of having an issue, calling issues into question. And I think what we see right now across the executive branch is a desire to call big questions into issue. And even within the White House itself, an enhanced desire to call big questions into issue. And it doesn't seem to be limited to just the executive branch, and maybe even just the one political party in the executive branch. So we might see a time when every auction house is open for every auction. And that's a time when you can expect a lot of money to pour down K Street. And of course, people who need to raise money for campaigns like that, and all political actors need that, like we need oxygen. They need it badly. It's interesting because this dynamic is happening now at a pace and in a depth and breadth that suggests that topics that we normally thought of as not really seriously open for conversation may now, in fact, be entirely open for conversation. They might settle out in a whole range of places. So in our discussion today, we can start to go through a couple of examples, whether it's China or the EU, whether it's intellectual property or national security, or even the specifics of so-called trade remedies or dispute resolution. We can plug each of these examples into what I hope is a single theme, that everything's open. Everything's open for change. So why don't I pause there, and I believe Tom Grant is next up at bat to give a brief introduction.
Hey, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Stephen. And apologies for the still photo. A little bit of a teething problem on the video aspect of the link, but I hope the audio is clear enough, at least technologically, even if intellectually maybe it won't be that clear, but I'll do my best to try to say something to bring some of these themes together. I mean, we're talking about trade, cross-cutting equities, and the executive branch and national security. So those are a number of different themes. They intersect in different ways. I thought we'd talk a little bit about that, and taking some of the lead from Stephen and from Scott. we think about technology as a historic driver for economic development and also a very important element in trade issues. And technology is one of those things. It's sort of like motherhood apple pie in baseball. Everybody's in favor of technology. So today we see the news that the Senate is debating a $110 billion appropriation for developing technology and encouraging technology development. Over the last several years, spanning both administrations, we see talk about issues of technology in the supply chain and ways to secure the supply chain. We see initiatives that pop up in practically every branch of government on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Who wants to lead the agency that has no AI strategy? Nobody raises his hand. The vaccine patent issue and TRIPS, WTO issues are also an issue you can see through the lens of technology. After all, we're talking about the development of life sciences equity that would historically, you would think of it as a patentable equity. If you look at the renegotiation of NAFTA and the emergence of the U.S., the USMCA, a very important, maybe not sufficiently appreciated dimension of that trade initiative, is that automotive manufacturing is a much more high-tech endeavor than it was 30 or 40 years ago. The components, if you're doing content requirements, and if you're looking at content requirements in the automotive industry, it's not just about putting aluminum and steel on a scale and weighing it. It's also about placing a valuation on a much larger high-tech input in the supply chain for that industry. So on and on it goes. The tech drives so many different equities in trade. One of the things you notice in law practice is that there's an increasing cross-cutting aspect where these issues intersect in ways that, again, even a short time ago, a generation, 20, 30 years ago, you would have been able to separate, segregate, treat these things as mutually separable. But now it's harder to take those equities apart because the currents are now so intermixed. Looking, for example, at some major tech players who have been in litigation on patent issues, but then lo and behold, they have trade-related international contests that work their way into what again, 30 years ago would have just been a patent dispute, for example, between Ericsson and Samsung. But then they got into a fascinating skirmish over removing the proceedings to Shanghai.
Thomas, I apologize.
Yeah.
Just to interrupt you for one moment, I wanted to alert you that your audio is fading out every once in a while, just a little bit for a moment or two. I don't know if you're moving around, but just to make you aware of that. Thank you.
Stephen, I'm sorry about that. I'll do my best. I don't. If there's a fix, I will do it. My apologies. So I wanted to just open with that sort of, it's almost a melange of different cross-cutting issues. But then I wanted to zero in on something at more of a granular level from my own experience in the administration at the Department of State. For several years, we had an ongoing discussion about how to deal with critical and emerging technologies. And there is indeed just at the level of nomenclature and at the level of definition, there was a great deal of interagency dialogue, and there still is, over how you define an emerging technology. And the answer that you give to that seemingly very basic threshold question of definition is going to relate in some part to the purpose for which you intend to use the definition. In other words, if you're looking at it from the standpoint, let's say, of supply chain security, that's going to be a different lens through which to look at the definition than if you're looking at it through traditional trade-related equities. So at the Department of State, there was an effort to put forward something that would constitute a new bureau for cyber security and emerging technology. And Scott was saying in Washington, when the opportunity comes to negotiate or to bargain or have an auction, if you will, over an issue, that attracts a lot of interest. And there was a great deal of bargaining over how to structure a new functionality to deal with emerging tech. Now, at some level, it's rather boring to be talking about organization charts. How do you rework the organization chart in a U.S. executive branch agency? If you want a new tech function, where does it belong? But actually, underlying that sort of seemingly inside baseball debate about where to lodge a new function in an existing bureau, there's some pretty interesting long-term problems of executive organization. If you place a new functionality, let's focus on cybersecurity and emerging tech. If you place it, for example, under the Undersecretary of State who handles international security, then that will imply and even require certain types of inputs, certain types of visibility. But if instead you put it under the Undersecretary who handles economic development, then that's going to bring the issue into the bailiwick of a very different set of civil servants and political appointees. There's a risk, in other words, of siloing, the silo risk, which people talk about so much when thinking about executive branch organization. How do you solve the problem of the silo risk, siloing, placing things in isolated silos? Well, then the answer some people suggest would be to have a direct report to the principal. Let the secretary be the direct report for a new technology bureau. Problem there is simple work overload. A single office or single officer can only do so much at one time. So you're pressing up against two constraints. The one constraint is if you place things in overly narrow categories, the thing doesn't get enough information to do its job. On the other hand, if in the interest of getting a sort of panopticon view of the issue, you make everything under the sun a direct report to the principal becomes paralyzed. Principal cannot function that way. That seems to me that's almost a permanent problem with the executive apparatus. Just at what level do you place lines of responsibility, lines of direct report? And how do you strike the balance between the need for maximizing information inputs and also actually having an efficient bureaucracy that functions? I don't think there are easy answers. I think some of the trade-related issues we're wrestling with now demonstrate why these administrative problems, which are long-standing problems, take on particular salience. Anyway, that's I would leave it at that. I think we've got it would be nice to kind of launch into conversation, kind of using that as maybe to instigate remarks, and hand it over to back to you, Stephen.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks, Scott. Let me note for everyone's benefit that Q&A is now officially open. We'll be taking questions only through this platform, AirMeet. Please use the raise hand button located in the bottom middle of your screen if you want to ask your question live. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you can type questions into the Q&A tab in the upper right of the screen, and you can do that at any time. So I'm going to take moderator's privilege and go ahead and fire a few questions at you based on what I just heard. And I'll start with Tom. Tom, you were just talking about how to structure different offices and where to place them and what it says about the priority and what it means if they're under one roof or another, figuratively speaking, or perhaps literally. But let me ask it this way. For all the moving of chairs that happens in any administration, not just different people in the chairs, but some restructuring, how much does it really matter in the sense that what any administration will prioritize will necessarily have the ear of the higher-ups who have the political clout to make the final calls on the tough issues?
Yeah. It's a really good question, Stephen. I mean, resources are a constant area of contestation in the executive branch and across government. Who gets how much in terms of personnel, which means budgets. That's one way perhaps to trace, that's one way to measure the degree of importance that the chief executive places on any given issue. Just how much does the administration budget for it? To what extent is the administration ready in this sort of auction house that Scott referred to? To what extent is the administration ready to use political capital in an auction when you need to have legislative action? I mean, one thing about org charts in the executive branch is that at a low enough level, you can change the org chart through the fiat of the agency head or maybe with the president's help. But then above a certain level of the org chart, you need to go back to Congress to have the statutory architecture itself changed to meet the requirements that you perceive. So that's a question as well. If the administration only cares enough to reorganize the furniture at the very on the ground floor, at the lowest levels of the apparatus, and not really willing to do shuttle diplomacy down Pennsylvania Avenue to talk about statutory refashioning, then maybe they don't care quite so much, or maybe they care a lot, but they just don't see that the time has come to make the case yet to their interlocutors in Congress. So that's a huge. It's something you can look. I think you can look at different pieces of evidence for signs of greater or lesser concern and dedication to particular issues.
Thank you.
May I join a bit of that? I wonder also, as we think about this auction house model, whether multiple, it's very easy to think of multiples as in competition with each other. But there's an old joke that a one-lawyer town is really bad for business for the lawyer, but a two-lawyer town, oh, that's great for business for the lawyers. An executive branch with one CFIUS panel calling the question for the interface among IP, trade, security, tech, and so forth. Well, I mean, that's neat. We've tried it. We amended it recently with a beefed up version through the FIRMA statute. What if we have several of those? What if there's USTR? What if there's state? What if commerce has its own? What if? That's a lot of auctions. And that creates a lot of, if your theory here is you're trying to get to optimum operation, maybe that's an interesting debate about how one manages complicated structures. But if your theory is there's not enough money pouring down K Street right now, and it'd be great to make rain, then suddenly the behavior is matching the hypothesis. The behavior is lots of focal points for calling of questions, and the hypothesis is that one wants to call lots of questions because that induces lots of input from those who pour money down K Street. So you might be seeing a lot of this. So let me give a concrete example. I think in the recent case at the International Trade Commission involving two basically Korean battery companies that were fighting over trade secrets relating to batteries for electric vehicles. This was a case located in the 337 docket at the ITC, a docket that's pretty familiar to people who think about commercial litigation. It resembles commercial litigation much more than it resembles regulation or administration. That docket, that case in that docket, made its way as it is permitted to in the statute, it made its way to the USTR's office, where the president has delegated authority for the possibility of injecting policy preference into that adjudication. 337, the statute itself, says that the executive branch is allowed to set aside one of these adjudications. It's not appellate review. It's not a disagreement on the facts or on the law. It's policy review, a disagreement on policy. This kind of action from the executive branch has generally in the past been very rare. It was done once during the Reagan administration and once during the Obama administration, and not in any significant way otherwise. But it showed up as a possibility in this recent spring of this year battery case involving these two Korean companies. What I think the trade bar watched the case. I think the trade bar thought, breathed a bit of a sigh of relief when the White House ultimately did not intervene to set aside the ITC adjudication. But I think that sigh of relief maybe was not fully informed, because what ended up happening in that case was a settlement, but a settlement where the executive branch of the United States was publicly speaking about the settlement in a way that's very familiar to those who watch kind of professional clearinghouses of mediation, in effect as a very active party mediator rather than in a behind the scenes role. Put differently, this looked like the executive branch was highly involved in structuring the settlement, and not only the executive branch of the United States, but also of Korea. And these were two very, very large Korean companies interacting with a number of American counterparts. So this is a kind of state industrial interaction that was pretty significant and is much more consistent with the Sotheby's Christie's auction house open for business hypothesis than with the kind of primary guesses about, are you pro or anti-trade or pro or anti-domestic industry or pro or anti-intellectual property. It's much more about being pro active engagement as a focal point for gathering large industrial players to come lobby.
All right, thank you. Interesting. So I'm going to ask one more question on this subject of personnel and structure, and then I'd like to, after that, turn to some of the specific substantive issues that are out there. There's an old saying that personnel is policy. So what do the Biden administration moves thus far on personnel, as well as restructuring, for example, considering the Office of Science and Technology Policy as a cabinet-level office, tell us about what the Biden administration has in store?
Sorry, there we go. You're seeing a lot of talented people inside. Their talents are often in areas that are not they're not primarily about coordination. So the question then becomes, how are professionals who are professionals at trade law or science research or so forth how are they going to master the interagency? And I think that's a complicated question. The good news is they're all smart, good people. The question becomes, why are they there? Are they there to represent an audience? Are they there to communicate with an audience? Are they there to be a bridge, or are they there to coordinate with each other? Those are very different roles.
Yeah, if I,
Please.
yeah, it's really pretty obvious. If you're going to have a modern administrative state to the scale and scope that we've developed ours to be, our executive branch has equities in practically every walk of life, every dimension of the economy. You expect that it be largely a highly technocratic organization. That was sort of the promise of the New Deal, 1933 onward. Lots of smart people from outside the government came into the government. Heretofore, there hadn't really been much of a government. Then, with the New Deal agencies and various fresh understandings of the Commerce Clause and the growth of administrative apparatus, you had to bring in a lot of technicians to operate the thing that was built. Now, we certainly expect scientific rigor and technological fluency, but it's also a kind of a mismatch in my mind. This might be a rather idiosyncratic view, but forgive me for that. But science is a process of making falsifiable statements, and then the scientific community tests them. And some of these falsifiable statements have been so resilient that we accept them almost as laws. If I drop a ball, it's going to go down because there's something called gravity that attracts the earth and the ball to one another. So we don't really consider that something that needs too much testing. But beyond that sort of rare example of a so-called rule of science or scientific truth, it's not really a discipline that deals in truths, verities, or sort of commands. Science is not designed to command us to do things. It's designed instead to test falsifiable statements. Now, government, by contrast, administrative apparatus, starting with the military, which is sort of the original kind of governmental entity going back before you had technocratic, trade-related and technology-related agencies, it's a command and control structure. It's about investing authority in certain individuals, and then other individuals do what those authorities say. And that's all well and good. You need that. Otherwise, you don't have an army. You don't have an administrative apparatus of any kind. But there's a bit of a mismatch between science as an actual discipline, the way it really functions, and a command and control apparatus. It's really the antithesis of command and control. So what do? You cannot not have a scientific function in the modern administrative state. You need scientists. One of the characteristics of international security and non-proliferation, which is the piece of the State Department with which I'm familiar from recent exposure, so I'm filled with very talented engineers and scientists with PhDs in all sorts of utterly fascinating topics, many of whom had devoted their careers to branches of their specialties where there probably is no really direct commercial private sector application. Trying to stop bad people from getting really dangerous things is sort of a governmental function. It's a defense and security function. And that's not only necessary, but it's a good thing that we have people willing to devote their careers as scientists and engineers to that sort of pursuit. But I've always thought there's a certain uncomfortable, not totally smooth and copacetic fit between any science and technology function and in the command and control aspects of a bureaucracy. Now you ask about the current administration. I think it's a case of having to watch this space on some of these emerging functionalities. It's always it's congenial to every administration to be seen to be doing something on science and technology, but then it goes back to our discussion a few minutes ago. What do you look for as evidence that any administration is actually serious, and how serious are they about a given initiative? What type of resources what type of, who are they choosing to fill the seats? And then after the ribbon cutting ceremony, so to speak, when it's all very exciting, fresh and new, after that, going down weeks, months, and years away, how much political capital are they willing to invest to keep the thing going? Sorry, it's a little bit of a long-winded kind of a philosophical take on it, but it seems this combination of having a clear view of what science can do and can't do, and then trying to marry that up with an understanding of how the executive apparatus actually functions. It's a tricky task, but I think that is the task that you have to perform if you're to make sense of this.
Well, and of course, the Office of Science, and Technology Policy has the word policy in its name, and it's located in the executive office of the president. And so anything that's policy and in an inherently political environment has a multitude of factors that will be weighed. Let me take both your comments just now and use that as a segue to talk about in some more detail this issue of the waiver of intellectual property, or the proposed waiver of some level of intellectual property, ostensibly to promote the production of more COVID vaccine faster. And I'll segue to it on an administrative front first, since that's what we were just talking about. By all accounts, the interagency process was at best suboptimal. The issue arose prior to Ambassador Tai's confirmation, and so there were elements within the administration that sought to stake out a position and leadership on internal consideration of the issue. When Ambassador Tai was confirmed and took office, she made efforts to impose a more rigorous bureaucratic structure to it in the context of the usual consideration of a trade issue within the auspices of the USTR structure. But in the end, it appears that a political decision was made by the chief executive, and his appointee for the trade office was required to carry that out. The degree to which she in her own heart agrees with that or not, we'll likely never know. But nonetheless, as an appointee of the president, one does what one is told, or one leaves office. So let me ask each of you to jump in on this, both in terms of the process, and if you want to start to lead in to the next phase of the question, which is, Tom, you talked a lot about science. Is there actually reason to think that suspending patents would have any effect whatsoever on the production of vaccines at this time?
Yeah, so look, I think it is, I love talking about innovation and healthcare, and I am very aware that my own contribution to healthcare from an innovation perspective may be merely that I believe I have figured out how to cure just about any case of insomnia by writing lots of books and articles on patent law. And certainly if any of the viewers out there are having trouble going to sleep, I've got a solution for you. Just come read the books. But I think on the question of is this stuff about patents? No. I think it's pretty clear that these vaccines were not significantly induced by anything resembling patents. There was a call to meet with executives in nations' capitals around the world, and business executives met with national executives, and deals got struck for vaccines to get produced and rolled out. And if there was any doubt lingering that nonetheless patents were somehow hindering development, the business executives have largely devoted tied their hands to the mast and said they're not going to be enforcing patents to stop anybody from producing a vaccine. So on neither side of the coin, the so-called pro or so-called anti side was this particular moment in time related to patents. So you're right. One question that people then ask is, so then why talk about patents or why talk about IP? And I think that gets back to the auction house model, because boy, can you increase the number of people bidding for political attention if you call that question. Again, Tom talked about science, and every high school physics student remembers well that if you forget to draw in the force of gravity on your force diagram, not only will your physics professor dock you a few points on your lab notebook, but that brick that's going to slide off your desk is still going to fall on your toe and hurt. So you got to remember that force of gravity. It gets you a couple of extra points on the exam, and it saves your toe. There are some other forces like gravity that, while open to investigation, are pretty well established as a matter of science. Again, established as a matter of science means they're still testable, but it does mean we've got a lot of data. And there are some interesting fields of science out there that we sometimes forget about. One of them is political science. Another one is economic science, and of course, they intersect with political economics. It's hard to think of a business that doesn't try to maximize profits. It's also hard to think of politically responsive actors who don't try to maximize political power, or at least political input. Sometimes the combination, and sometimes they feed off each other. So, opening up the auction house by reminding the world that large industrial players around the world ought to come to Washington to talk about industrial policy is a great way to get more money pouring into K Street. And it's a great way to get more money pouring into as many different parts of the discussions as possible. On the one hand, some people might cry in their soup about that. On the other hand, look, good government should listen to good ideas, and people who used to be world-class scientists and are now government administrators, or used to be world-class staffers on Capitol Hill and now are administrators. They now, in their expertise as administrators, no longer presumably have current expertise in these other activities. So it makes sense for them to want to get input. And of course, we have the First Amendment. People in our society have a First Amendment interest in speaking to their government. So I'm not suggesting that government shouldn't be open for input, but what I am wondering is the incentives inside the org chart matter. So let me just be specific. It is worth noticing that in a bipartisan way, both the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, two presidents from two different political traditions, both of their administrations focused in on a set of ideas about how innovation gets done that focused primarily not merely on the question of creating ideas or inventing ideas, so-called basic science, but instead focused on the downstream stuff, commercializing technology to bring it to market. And both of those presidential administrations from two very different ends of the political spectrum came to the same outcome, which was to think about the idea as a consensus idea of, let's call it, strong intellectual property rights. And both of those presidential administrations deliberately socialized within their executive branches those ideas in order to coordinate out from the government, coordinating devices, a strong IP system, not as tools to reward magical people for doing magical things, but as beacons around which a bunch of different unknown and unnamed people and actors could coordinate with each other. That beacon strong IP approach is one that jurists across the political spectrum have embraced. Famous judges like Learned Hand, a centrist Democrat, Jerome Frank, a progressive Democrat, Giles Rich, a centrist Republican, a relatively diverse group of jurists, a relatively diverse group of political actors directly, explicitly coordinating with each other about a more hands-off approach for facilitating commercialization outside of government with a strong IP system. That seems to be the opposite of the approach that is associated with the current set of activities. And then the question becomes, are the current activities opposite of that approach because they want to reach the opposite outcome, or because they want to put all of this in question? They want to put it all up for auction. You know, the bad news is you can lose an auction. The good news is you can win an auction. So I would say for those who are interested in those kinds of ideas, now may be a good time across the political aisle to coordinate around a perspective, an approach, a set of ideas that we've seen before with both Democrats and Republicans. But it is different than the approach we're at least being called to consider by the actions you were just highlighting.
And might I add a word, Stephen?
Please, please.
I defer to you. You're as master of ceremonies. You should cut me off if I take it too far down a path that we might just leave aside. Looking at the patent issue, you see as a general problem of administrative power in a system that there are administrative tools that are extremely attractive when there is something like a public consensus about the existence of a particular problem. There are types of problems that people find very difficult to coordinate solutions around on their own, but if you've got central authority, and we all broadly agree X, Y, or Z constitutes a problem, central government apparatus is just extremely good at directing resources in a sometimes pretty blunt way, but a very targeted way at the same time. You can bring the sledgehammer down onto a problem if we all agree the thing is a problem. Now, I'm not really qualified to judge myself, whether patent is the choke point on vaccine production and distribution. It occurs to me, and I guess it occurs to the current federal government of Germany, that maybe patent rights are not the choke point. Maybe the choke point is production. Maybe the choke point is logistics and distribution. But putting that aside, and let us, just for purposes of argument only, let us say the choke point really is patent rights, and that's what's slowing it down. I'm skeptical, but let's just for purposes of argument say it's the patent's the problem. Okay, so you bring a targeted public solution using all the weight of government, bringing it down onto the patent issue. You solve the issue by waiving patent rights. That becomes a little bit habit forming, I think. And I'm just going on the basis of a little bit of administrative law history and a little bit of armchair psychology. But when you do something and it rewards you in some way, you tend to keep doing that thing, all else being equal. Max Weber taught us that bureaucracies are all about growing bureaucracies. Once you create one, it grows on its own. That ought to be in our set of considerations whenever we deploy an executive apparatus solution, because not that the solution might fail today on this issue, though it might, but because even if it works, maybe especially if it works, it becomes habit forming, and you start doing the same thing to situations where we really do not have such consensus that a solution is needed. And you start to apply the solution to situations where really it would have been better to allow different elements of society to coordinate on their own without the command and control structure telling them what to do. So I guess, in a nutshell, my concerns are, first, the premise might not be right. Maybe we really don't need to waive patents to get the vaccines out faster. The second point, though, is what happens to the rest of the patent architecture if you take a wrecking ball theoretically in a selective way to one piece, but then you see, well, that's kind of fun. Let's keep doing that. There's a danger there.
Well, and related to the science question, the old saying, at least I thought was inextricably linked with this notion of scientific hypothesis, is the idea that there is a set of facts that, if true, would cause us to discard the hypothesis. So if the hypothesis is this intervention is needed, what set of facts, if true, would cause us to conclude this intervention is maybe, dare I say, not needed? And if the answer to that discussion is, pshaw, please, you're really getting in the way of important things by making us build a record to answer that question in writing, then that sure seems a lot different than the stuff we generally think of as the rule of law and good administration of government. We generally think of rule of law and good administration of government as a system where people say openly to themselves and each other why they're doing things and why they're going to not do them and why those things are important in some way other than the identity of the person doing it. Because, if person one gets to do it, why doesn't person two of opposite political valence get to do it too? And if one is generally interested in thinking about the it as a bad, then maybe we don't want either one doing it. Maybe another way to think about this is in lawyer speak. Patent law is part of the United States Code. The United States Code has been codified over the last 100 years. We went through a significant amount of effort in Washington to codify our code, to organize federal law into topics. Patent law is Title 35. We got 34 up before and a whole bunch after. And, if what you really think you ought to do is delete Title 35, that's easy to do. It can be done. It would be a lot easier for industry to organize itself if it knew yay or nay Title 35 had been deleted. It will be a lot more anxiety provoking, but a lot better for the auction houses to keep calling the question whether in effect Title 35 is getting deleted.
So let me challenge some of your comments just there a little bit, as I promised, playing devil's advocate. So oftentimes, an administration does not get to choose the issue of the day. The issue of the day is thrust upon them. And the coronavirus is, of course, a perfect yet terrible example of that. So first the Trump administration, now the Biden administration is dealing with this once-in-a-century global pandemic. India and South Africa forced this issue, presumably out of perception of self-interest. The Biden administration is forced to address it. They could have left it hanging in a way that might arguably have kept to use Scott's analogy, kept the auction open longer. So that's one question. Here's another aspect to it, because when we're dealing with international trade, which is by definition a subset of international affairs and foreign affairs, one has to consider the ramifications beyond domestic stakeholders and domestic interests. And I note that one of the common critiques from the left of the Trump administration's trade policy was that it was insufficiently multi-party, that it was a go-it-alone approach. We didn't particularly care about our European allies, and that harmed us. In fact, in some cases, we took action that aggravated our European allies. And yet, this administration has just made this announcement about the proposed waiver with no notice by most reports, by all reports I've seen, no notice to the European allies who were standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States in opposition to this waiver. And now, where some predicted that the EU countries would drop their objections the moment the United States did, on the contrary, France, Germany have been quite vocal in continuing to object and now criticizing the United States for what appears to be a non-substantive political approach. What do you say about that?
Well, I think those are all interesting points, and one response is to just say the Trump approach seemed to be, let's call it, more bilateral rather than multilateral. I don't know whether we're going to see that the Biden approach is more multi or all multi. I think I just don't know. I don't get the sense that the Biden administration's approach is to cut off the rest of the world. I think it's to reframe conversations and remind everyone that everything's up for discussion, or auction, or discussion, or auction, or both, or just come talk to us. So I think it is an effective short-term political strategy for gathering all the iron filings on the proverbial desk of the world to line up with Washington, at least the ones that want to, the ones that have their own self-interest too. It'll be interesting to see where things settle out on that front. But I think, getting back to the first part of what you were talking about, I do want to be really clear where everyone comes down on the debate about so-called whether one ought to have patents or whether one ought to enforce patents in certain ways. There has long been, even among the very pro-patent-oriented crowd, an explicit recognition that in the language of the U.S. system, for example, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution does not seem to prevent the government from taking stuff. It seems to require the government to provide just compensation when it takes stuff. And so the notions of sovereign immunity that are extremely old and go far before the United States and beyond the United States, those notions can coexist with intellectual property regimes and allow for lots of pressure release valve, lots of escape clause, lots of room to maneuver to cope with emergencies that just require a little bit more government forbearance. That government forbearance either can come in the type of decision-making where the government says, well, if we have to pay for it, maybe we shouldn't do it, or the kind of government forbearance that comes in the form of the government making itself amenable to suit. The United States government has graciously made itself amenable to suit in a lot of settings. And going back to the Civil War, one of the traditions that Lincoln very proudly promulgated was an explicit court designed to, in the federal system, locate adjudication against the government, so that the public could fully and fairly bring actions against the government that would get the kind of compensation that the Fifth Amendment would suggest is appropriate. So that kind of concept of forbearance and collaboration with the citizenry is a different kind of dynamic interaction than come to K Street and pour your money to the auction.
That observation by Scott really spurs it spurs me to put my historian's cap back on, especially if you think of Lincoln's initiatives in the Civil War. But you think this is Federalist Society Executive Branch Week. If you're thinking about the very origins of the American administrative state, they are trade-based very heavily, not exclusively, but very heavily. If you asked where is the federal apparatus circa the year 1850, the customs house in New York. Apart from a couple of other customs houses, that was pretty much almost the full ball of wax when it came to executive apparatus. It's not coincidental that trade is such a central consideration 200 years, 180 years later when we're thinking about executive branch action. One of the major differences, and it is no great surprise to say things have changed in the last 180 years, of course, but trade in its classic format century ago was tariffs. Trade was an issue of tariff control. The emergence of several of the major European federal states, especially Germany and Italy, were driven by tariff barrier removal. But it was basically about putting imposts and duties on physical artifacts moving across borders. But today, the degree of economic integration is that much greater, and technology comes into play in ways that people wouldn't have imagined possible 120, 130 years ago. So the non-tariff barriers to trade become a vastly more significant part of the picture. So if you're thinking about action to change patent law, one way or the other, strengthening, weakening, going sideways, you're going to have trade impacts that go well beyond traditional concerns over imposts and duties on physical artifacts. And that goes to not just the patent debate, but if you start looking at things like the Senate discussion today about $110 billion appropriation for a technology driving program, that's maybe large enough. I'm not a macro economist, but it may be large enough in certain targeted sectors to have trade related impacts. If you start having something on that scale influencing who wins, who loses, who gets the attention, that may not just be subject matter for one trade jurisdiction. It may affect other jurisdictions. And the same goes for monetary policy, where you've got really large increases in liquidity. You lose track of how many trillions, but it's trillions, and that is not just a monetary issue. That has trade aspects. And Stephen, and if I could, without taking up too much the time on one question, but it's such a fascinating question. You asked, Stephen, what about allies, and what about the approach of the current administration and the Trump administration to allies and trade? I think there might be some interesting lessons to be drawn from history there as well. If you look back at the early stages of the Second World War, which I think we can agree was a time of emergency. Governments don't choose the issues that they deal with. Sometimes, as you said, Stephen, the issues are sort of landed on them, and certainly the outbreak of World War II, it's something none of the democratic countries chose or desired, but they had to deal with it. Waiver was the architect of Britain's wartime mobilization, was a Canadian businessman. He was adamantly opposed to the proposition that was put forward quite seriously by quite a few people of a trade union between Canada and the idea was there'd be the beginnings of a British Empire single trade zone, which actually did not exist. These were separate, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, whilst part of the British Empire notionally had their own trade policies. But the thought was, hey, this is high time, given common cause that we all must.
Tom, your audio is slipping back out from time to time again.
Is that better like that? I'm sorry.
This is much better. Yes, thank you.
Is that better? So you think of that period of time as one where it would have been high time for allies to act like allies. Shoulder to shoulder, let's agree on everything. And there was serious momentum in Parliament in Ottawa and Parliament in Westminster to have a trade union, a transatlantic British-Canadian trade union. But it did not happen. Beaverbrook himself said, no, we're not going to do that. The interests are too divergent, not going to happen. Now, in the current parlance, in the current narrative, one would then exclaim, but allies don't do that. Well, I'm sorry, as a matter of fact, allies do in fact protect their trade equities. It's not necessarily the case that political and military exigency lead to everybody being on the exact same page when it comes to trade, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and so forth. Those can be on very separate tracks, even under the seemingly overwhelming pressure of a crisis such as 1940-41. So just trying to take a little bit of perspective on that, and maybe it's not so surprising when allies do go their separate ways on trade-related matters. I just wanted to put that out for sort of food for thought.
May I briefly just follow up and just mention, it also is interesting to note that around the time of the Civil War, the politics of trade were so heated that they were a significant contributor to the entire notion of the choice to go to war with ourselves, the politics of tariffs between the North and the South. But on the one hand, gosh, what a horrendous price to pay. We fought with ourselves. On the other hand, remember, part of the reason for the intensity was that we were financing the entire operation of the federal government on tariffs. This is before an income tax. And now, of course, trade is significantly delinked from the day-to-day fiscal operation of most governments that we're talking about here, because most governments finance their operations with totally different forms of taxes. In Europe, they have the VAT, essentially a consumption tax. And in the United States, we have what is basically an income tax, although it's kind of a wealth tax and some other things too. But the point is, what it's not is primarily a tariff. Yes, we have tariffs, and yes, they have tariffs in Asia and in Europe, but we and they finance the operations of the national government with something other than the tariff. So what that allows the central government in each of these locations to do is to play much more the role of auctioneer with their own and foreign industrial interests, because they're not choking off their government's own ability to pay for day-to-day operations. And that's part of what makes the auction house model so attractive these days, is you don't have to worry about civil war so much.
So let me pause for one moment to remind everyone in the audience that we are open for questions. You can type your questions in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question live. I've got to say, I've never been involved in a trade discussion that didn't have audience questions, but until the audience gets going, I'm perfectly happy to continue making waves. So with that in mind, I'll go slightly beyond the moderator's usual role and reflect back on my days when I was in government at the U.S. Copyright Office. A substantial part of that time was spent negotiating free trade agreements on behalf of the United States and in cooperation with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and other executive branch agencies. And tie this back to particularly what Tom was talking about, but also echoed by Scott. how a century and a half ago, the tariff was the primary tool of income for the government, was the primary tool of trade for the government. In the context of our modern free trade agreements, we have been quite willing to give away, I should say, reduce tariffs in exchange for compliance with non-tariff trade barriers, including perhaps most prominently intellectual property. And I find that an interesting observation in the context of the TRIPS waiver, because having negotiated hard to get what we got in TRIPS itself, and then further in a number of bilateral and regional trade agreements, we're now giving that away too, at least in this one context.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Steve. I mean, you're right that we have socialized a vocabulary and a style that was very focused on the importance of intellectual property to everyone in the developed world, as well as suggesting that in fact it would be also helpful in the developing world. And now the narrative, now the script has flipped. That calling this question makes it's very easy to click along to a smooth jazz rhythm, but screech like nails on a chalkboard when you go immediately to heavy metal or rock and roll, or you pick the other form of music. Here in the trade discussions, we the United States, were generally speaking together with allies who, for non-military reasons, at least nominally, were all also singing off the same page of the songbook that IP was generally helpful to everyone. And now we are singing off of a very different songbook, or at least calling the question, is there a songbook about IP? And if so, opening ourselves up to the question of, what page do we want to be on? I don't know how much conflict that will create, but you are right. It certainly creates some dissonance. There are some other conflicts, though, that are starting to emerge that are pretty high visibility. So one of them is how you even do adjudication. And, this started to percolate up in a particular patent case involving two non-U.S. entities, a European entity and a Korean entity, Ericsson and Samsung, in the context of a patent dispute pending in China and in the United States. But the conflict ended up becoming, can courts in country A enjoin parties from appearing before courts in countries B, C, D, maybe all the way up through Z. And that conflict where one country tries to shut down another country's access to courts, it is starting to heat up quite a bit. That particular case settled as between those two particular commercial parties in a worldwide settlement involving their own business interests, but that left very open the question of how to handle these anti-suit injunctions. And similarly, you have just seen last week in the Court of Justice for the European Union a case pending in which the question is being asked, how should a sovereign system, the EU is essentially a collection of sovereigns, but in some respects it acts like a sovereign. To what extent can it and should it block U.S. security sanctions against countries like Iran from having a commercial impact inside the EU? And so I think you're going to see these anti-suit injunctions and blocking statutes. You're going to see all of those conflicts. That's going to heat up very quickly.
Yeah, if I could jump in, Stephen, on Scott's observations, I just add to that, and also maybe go off, diverge just a little bit. But there's sort of an assumption in free trade models that firm-to-firm competition is extremely good for the market, for innovation, for economic growth, and personally, I subscribe to that. Competition leads to societal benefit, but in a trade context where the sovereigns are involved, where it's an inter-sovereign agreement under treaty, so it actually is international law coming into the picture, it's not just firm-to-firm competition. Even when you're dealing with allies with relatively similar operating systems, rule of law, good commercial code, good commercial judges, statutory enactments that are conducive to market competition. Even there, the sovereigns are also coming into play so that what might theoretically be a level playing field for firm-to-firm competition also has these other players involved. Maybe they're just referees. That would be perhaps the better outcome, but often they're not just referees, they're players. And you've got relatively mercantilist philosophies in some countries, industrial policy or whatever title you want to give it. And when developing trade policy, and Stephen, you probably saw this in your work in the Patent Office working with USTR and other executive agencies, you have to ask yourself, what else will the government interlocutor be trying to do in order to influence the playing field? So are we really dealing with a free market of firm-to-firm competition, for example, between American and not to pick on any one country, but Chinese firms? Sometimes, yes, it is genuine market competition, but sometimes not. And I think in some of these, for example, the Ericsson-Samsung matter that Scott mentioned, where ostensibly it's a pair of dueling an anti-suit injunction, and then, believe it or not, an anti-suit injunction. Are the parties in the courts really the only thing involved, or are there perhaps executive equities on one side or the other that also influence the playing field? And it seems that well could be and also that EU matter. I mean, it's an EU kind of sovereign concern over extraterritorial effects of U.S. law. That's not just a market issue.
So we have a question from the audience from Dr. Roger Klein, which fits perfectly into the theme of what we're intellectual property trade and the executive branch review week here at the Federalist Society. Given that Congress, in the context of the Uruguay Round Agreement, effectively created property interests in the adherence to minimum standards of IP protection, is it within the president's power to abrogate these statutorily created property rights without Congress? And Scott, this probably alludes back to your reference to the Fifth Amendment takings clause as well.
Yeah, this is, I mean, it's a wonderful question, and it's very close to a question I would give, or dare I say, have given on a final exam and even just a first-year property course, assuming the students have no knowledge of the specifics. Can they spot the general questions? And it seems to me the general questions start to include the following. First of all, what is your approach to a takings analysis? Do you think the public use question is a serious pause point or advocacy point along the road to doing a takings analysis? Some would say it is, some would say it isn't, some would say it must be, some would say it must not be, but that wouldn't end the discussion. The next conversation, the next stopping off point would be, in this language of issue spotting, would be, fine, what takings analysis do you even want to go through? Do you want to go through something resembling Penn Central, Penn Coal? Do you want to try to think about this as total economic wipeout? Do you want to think about this as something analogous to permanent physical? Or do you really want to pivot and not think about this as a takings problem, but something much more analogous to the switch that can happen inside a highly active regulatory or administrative branch. Sometimes the administrative or regulatory system pivots, and sometimes that pivot can create what much more resembles a breach of contract cause of action than a property takings cause of action. So in the parlance of those who are very familiar with U.S. litigation, this would be something like the Winstar cases brought after the savings and loan debacle and the capitalization requirements that allowed banks to savings and loans to basically merge. And then a shift in those capitalization requirements, which then triggered a lawsuit, the kind of most famous of which was named after a bank called Winstar. But that one sounded much less like a takings case and much more like a breach of contract case. So yes, there are a lot of arguments here. The problem is, how do you, if you're running an industry inside or outside of the United States, or you're running the general counsel operation either inside a law firm or inside a GC's office, how do you think about these things? And I think what at least I'm seeing is these days, a lot of businesses and a lot of lawyers are finding that they need strategies that are highly informed by these diverse siloed areas of law and siloed areas of jurisdiction. So you need more than U.S. law, you need more than patent law, you need more than takings law, you need a bundle. You need a bundle of approaches where you can think about particular venues, particular doctrines, and particular national legal and international legal systems before you can, as a business, mount an effective strategy. I think the good news is these strategies can be built and run. I think right now the dominant strategy that I think too many businesses are still focused on is, whatever it is, I'm just going to pour more money down K Street. And I think that strategy plays in very well to the auction house strategy. Every auction house will welcome you. Every casino loves a big whale, but I don't know that competing to be the biggest whale is the right strategy when you're in that environment. I think the right strategy in that environment is a more technical strategy, one that is informed by these different areas.
So, Tom, let me invite you to make I hope a quick comment if I can ask, and I want to respond to this briefly as well. And then I had one more question in the 5 or so minutes that we have left on the panel.
Thank you, Stephen. Really quick, just thinking about the Uruguay round, but there's also the whole universe of investment treaties, bilateral as well as the USMCA, which do contain their minimum standard rules and investor protection rules, and there might just be some interest in looking into the impact on some of those obligations if you're talking about major changes to patent rights through executive action. Just leave it at that.
That's a really interesting point, Tom. So what I wanted to say on this very briefly is if the TRIPS Council agrees to waive some portion of the TRIPS agreement, that will suspend the obligations of every WTO member to comply with whatever is quote unquote waived. Does that mean that the United States Congress or that the United States Patent Act at that moment is suspended? No. I agree with the question, the pretext of the question, that for the U.S. Copyright Act or the U.S. Patent Act to be suspended in some way would absolutely require congressional action, and that would trigger domestically the sort of analysis Scott just discussed in depth. Of course, Tom alludes to the fact that this could also happen around the world. Every member of the WTO would be free, under such an agreement, to suspend existing rights. The Fifth Amendment does not apply outside the United States, of course. And since it is the executive branch that decides whether or not to initiate any sort of a dispute process under the auspices of the WTO, one would imagine that agreeing to the waiver would be tantamount to agreeing not to initiate such a dispute. However, as Tom points out, there are other instruments that allow investor-state dispute settlement processes where the dispute is brought by the private entity, not the government, and where those exist under perhaps other instruments that require some of the protections that the waiver would purport to abrogate within the TRIPS agreement, could provide a basis for litigation. We've got just over 2 minutes left, which is hardly adequate to address the topic I'm going to raise, but you've both now alluded to issues of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, intellectual property, currency manipulation, and all of that points us to China. So, as I'll invite you to give about 1 minute each in terms of what should the Biden administration be looking to do on China, and any quick closing remarks you have before we end the panel.
I'll just briefly point out that while Chinese courts and agencies are truly first in class in reaching decisions that are founded well in a record using the best lawyer and economic and technical skills, and also generally fair as between party A and party B, it is vital for those outside of China to remember that those courts and agencies inside of China are also operating inside a very powerful central government with a very strong military-civil fusion that would demand, in fact, require and coerce full compliance with the obligation to draw all information brought into those adjudications into the security state and back out through the Belt and Road Initiative through the hands of favored state actors inside China. So put differently, while a lot of people celebrate the incredible professionalism of Chinese courts and agencies right now, I think right now is exactly the wrong time to choose to go litigate there if what you want to do is avoid any of those things that I just mentioned.
I think it goes back to that issue that we were talking about on whether you're really looking at a firm-to-firm competition on a level playing field. Is the government a referee, or is the government also a player? And I think what Scott was getting at is, the government in some countries can be a player as well. The thing I would add about China specifically, Stephen, in response to your invitation, is that historically, looking back the last 40, 50, 60 years, beginning of the Cold War through to the present, and the new challenges of Iran's nuclearization, North Korea's nuclearization, the export of terrorism by certain countries, sanctions have been largely a United States instrument, sometimes joined by allies in Europe, Japan, Australia, and so forth. And sanctions have had largely similar geopolitical targets. Let's stop terrorism. Let's stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Let's defend democracy, human rights. But sanctions have been, again, largely aimed at similar targets. We now see, though, that China is starting to think about sanctions as a tool in China's toolkit. And sanctions have an interplay with trade. One of the fraught issues of WTO law is the legality of certain types of economic sanctions. That's been bandied about by academics, but also governments. But that's been against a backdrop of essentially like-minded countries adopting essentially broadly aligned sanctions, devil's in the details, but at least UK, US, EU have some sort of shared philosophical groundwork. But now we do see that one of the world's biggest financial, economic, commercial, trade countries, China, is starting to learn about using sanctions. That seems to me to be an area that could raise quite a few challenges for trade, as well as security and geopolitics.
Thanks, Tom. I agree that sanctions represent an interesting subset of many of these issues, and certainly your reference to Iranian-supported terrorism is particularly timely. So, as we close down the panel now, let me note that AirMeet offers great opportunity to meet up with friends in the lounge. Please join us in the lounge to network with other participants, ask questions of our panelists, who I believe have agreed to spend some time there. As the session concludes, you'll see an alert in the top right corner of your screen. Click on that to move to the lounge, and then click on one of the boxes that appears to, quote, join a table. You'll need to turn your camera and mic back on when you sit at the table, but that shouldn't be too difficult. Thank you to both Scott and Tom, as well as to all of you in the audience and to the Federalist Society for this very interesting panel. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Reminder that the next conference event will be tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, Civil Rights in the New Administration. So stand by now for the alert directing you to the lounge, and watch out for Colonel Mustard. I hear he may be wielding a knife. Thank you again.